since I do a lot of caving themed stuff, and that is kind of my hobby and passion, I want to tell you about a story. And you don't have to be a caver, you don't have to like caves to kind of get fascinated with this story. Even though it does revolve around a cave, this is a really neat human interest story. So it's about a gentleman who lived back in the early 1900s. His name is Floyd Collins. The Floyd Collins family grew up in rural Kentucky, just a few miles down the road from the famous Mammoth Cave. And growing up as a kid, Floyd, he gained the reputation of being a pretty amazing cave explorer. He had discovered several smaller caves all over the hillsides and rural communities. And eventually he found a pretty extensive cave on his father's farm. He named it Crystal Cave. It's also been known as Floyd Collins Crystal Cave. But Crystal Cave was a huge cave, beautiful. And they commercialized it, and they were trying to siphon off business from all the other caves in the area, especially Mammoth Cave. But it was lacking in one very important thing, and that's location. You got to Mammoth Cave, it was very easy to get to some of the other caves in that area. Floyd's Crystal Cave was pretty difficult to get to. You had to travel a little bit further down an old road that would wash out, up and down some valleys and ridges. By the time you got there, it was just hard to get to. So Floyd decided, I'm going to focus my effort on finding another cave closer to the main highway, maybe even on the road going to Mammoth Cave. So if people are headed to Mammoth Cave, maybe they would actually come to another new cave discovered by Floyd and stop and see it first. So there was a little sandstone bluff, and they called it Sand Cave. And the farm it was on, Floyd made a deal with them. He said, you know, if I can discover that this is a big cave, if it opens up and turns out to be something useful, we'll go in partners 50-50. So in 1925, Floyd crawls into Sand Cave. The next day, the farmer is thinking, well, I wonder what Floyd found. I haven't heard anything back from him. And then he started getting worried about him. So the farmer and his young son went out to Sand Cave, and Floyd's coat was still hanging outside. Bad sign. The little son was small enough to squeeze down into the narrow little crevice down into the earth. And he started hollering for Floyd, and Floyd yelled back that he was trapped, that go get his brothers, you know, they'll know what to do. So they ran across the ridges and farmland, and they told the family. Brothers came. One of them crawled down to him. Turns out his leg was stuck under a boulder that had dislodged as Floyd was crawling back out of the cave. Evidently it opened up and got big, but Floyd needed to crawl back out and tell people, or maybe get some extra help and work to try to develop it. On the way back out of the cave, as he's squirming and squeezing like a worm, just inching his way through, a rock comes loose off the wall or ceiling and falls on his leg. He can't move forward, he can't move backwards, he can't reach down and grab his foot. He can dig a little bit. In the process of him kind of squirming around, he knocks his lantern out, and now, boom, he's in the dark. So the family, brothers trying to get him, they were able to get some food to him and feed him, but they really didn't know how to get him out. They couldn't dig through solid bedrock. They couldn't even see around his body. His body was completely covering up the passageway, so they couldn't even crawl over him to get to the other side to get the rock loose. So it became a race against time. What are they going to do? They need more help. So they spread the word. People come from all over to help. Most people just came to stand around and watch. Kind of like a big car wreck today. You got all these rubberneckers just watching. Now, about 10 miles away was a little town called Cave City. And in 1925, Cave City had a population of about 5,000 people. Well, after several days of this rescue attempt and the newspapers and people getting a hold of this story and it spreading like wildfire, there were 10,000 people gathered out in the woods around Sand Cave. That Sunday, they actually referred to it as Carnival Sunday because it was just crazy. So many people. Newspapers, radio, this story was still spreading. Meanwhile, poor Floyd's down in the cave just wondering who's going to help him. And here's probably the worst part of this story leading up to this point was after 3 or 4 days of people crawling into him, trying to feed him and talk with him, they had crawled in and out of those passageways so much they had dislodged and loosened more rocks that had collapsed in, closing up the crawlway to Floyd. Now they could not get to him to even feed him. The National Guard was brought in to control this huge crowd. They set up a fence around the area. The National Guard commander decided he would take over rescue efforts and that they needed to dig a shaft. Now this is 1925. They had never really rescued people out of the ground like this before. So they went and got some rock quarry people. They began digging a rescue shaft. They weren't digging very fast. Things weren't going very well. The bedrock's pretty hard. This was in the winter of 1925. Days and days and days are going by. So days and days and days are going by, and finally the rescue shaft is completed. They get into the cave tunnel, but Floyd had already passed away. But this is where the story just gets interesting. It was too dangerous to bring the body out, so they actually had a funeral right there out in the woods around the cave and left the body in there. A couple of months go by, the family raised enough money to reopen the shaft and get that body out so they could have a proper burial at the family cemetery out at the house. So they had a second funeral a few months later. Well, then people decided, you know what? The whole nation and even other countries had heard of this crazy story about this person being trapped in a cave. So now people traveling to Mammoth Cave were willing to travel a little bit further down the rough roads just to go see that old family farm cave that he had discovered, Crystal Cave, several years before. Now it's becoming a pretty popular place to visit. The family still owns that area. That's where Floyd's still buried, but they decide to sell it. Probably just it didn't set well with them having to tell that story day in and day out. Turns out the guy who buys the farm and the cave also owns the property where the body's buried, and he decides, hey, I own everything on this property. So he digs up the casket, carries the casket down into Crystal Cave, and says, hey, come take tours at Crystal Cave. Meet Floyd. He's down there. They had a third funeral for him, by the way, down in there in the cave. A couple of years go by, and they open for business, and the casket's open. The body's gone. They search. About 24 hours later, they find the body stashed off in the woods somewhere next to the river. Bring the body back, put it back in the cave, back in the casket. Another funeral. I think, was that number 4 now? So, meanwhile, while this is going on, the Mammoth Cave National Park is building steam, and they're wanting to purchase all the properties in that area to make it a new national park. Eventually that happens, and they close Crystal Cave, and you hope that's the end of the story, but it's not. The family, the relatives, many years later, are still wanting them to take Floyd out of Crystal Cave and put him in the Mammoth Cave Baptist Church Cemetery next to brothers and cousins and mom and some other family members. And so the Park Service eventually helped the family get the body out of the cave and give him another final funeral, hopefully final funeral. Remember, he died in 1925. The last funeral last burial was in, I think it was 1989. So this story is just crazy, but there's all kinds of side stories to it about photographers and newspaper writers just taking pictures of the dog sitting next to the cave, talking about Floyd's dogs waiting for Floyd to come out of the cave. People are saying, that's not Floyd's dog. And they said, well, when it's printed in the paper tomorrow, it will be. So they were trying to sensationalize this in so many different ways. Even the White House and Congress were getting radio updates every afternoon about what was happening to this gentleman trapped in the hills of Kentucky. When Floyd died in 1925, it also reignited the conversation of making Mammoth Cave a protected site. And so legislation was introduced the very following year in 1926, and they had authorized Mammoth Cave to become a national park. They didn't want people dying trying to find the next new cave just to make a couple extra dollars. They were really concerned that this was just going to snowball and more people were going to get hurt and killed competing for those tourist dollars in the area. Crystal Cave has never been open to the public since then. You can go visit his grave site, which is in the park now. You can go visit his home site. His house is still standing in the park. The park decided we need to preserve this and keep that story alive. So that's kind of interesting too that they did that. Now, in 1925, when this happened, it was a tragedy, and sometimes people keep tragedies alive by writing books or singing songs or doing other things. There was a song called The Ballad of Floyd Collins, which became a huge hit back in the early 1920s. There was a off-Broadway musical, a musical about Floyd Collins, a musical about a man being trapped underground. Believe it or not, musical is still going on all over the nation. A lot of universities still put on this musical. There are other countries. I know over in Europe there are still some Floyd Collins musicals. Google that. Google the Floyd Collins story. Google the Floyd Collins musical. Look it up on YouTube. There's songs and everything. I didn't know much about the story, and I grew up not far from here where it all happened. It's just a crazy story. The best book out there is this right here. It's called Trapped, The Story of Floyd Collins. And the guy who wrote this book did a great job explaining it and talking about the politics around it, how his friends felt as they were trying to rescue him, how the National Guard was trying to handle the situation, Mom and Dad, how they're feeling, his brothers who were just working tirelessly. It's a good read. It's a good human interest story. Another interesting side note is that when it was a national park, all the cave explorers researching the cave, turns out in 1972, I believe it was, a group of cavers, part of the Cave Research Foundation, actually went into Crystal Cave, that Floyd Collins Crystal Cave, which was in the national park. This is in the 70s now, and actually come out of Mammoth Cave, connecting the two giant cave systems together. And ever since then, Mammoth Cave has been the longest surveyed and mapped cave in the world. And so as good a caver as Floyd was, and as many caves as he did discover, turns out he was right in a lot of his ideas that some of those big caves that he owned were actually part of Mammoth Cave or bigger than Mammoth Cave. So that was interesting that several decades later, after Floyd was long gone, they kind of proved that one of his theories was correct. So I'm going to have some photos about Floyd Collins and stuff that I'm putting on here as I talk. I've probably already seen some, but hope you enjoyed this video. Look this story up if you want to learn more about it. I'm going to be doing some more videos very shortly, so stay tuned.